Hey guys, so here is the third video in our period one section. We're still talking about from the dawn of civilization and human history up till about the year 600 BCE or so. And for this video, we're going to be talking about culture. Now, culture is a somewhat broad concept. It's a big topic. There's a lot that can go into culture. You've got language, you've got religion, there's arts and so forth. So today we're going to try and cover as much as we can for a lot of these ancient civilizations. Now remember, for civilizations, there's those checklist that you had. Depending on what textbook you use, you might have 6 or 7 different features that constitute something as civilization. But one of the more common ones you always see is art and architecture. All right, so in these ancient civilizations, you have architecture, but architecture could just be the building of a hut. We're talking massive architecture, okay, big architecture, as well as urban planning, because cities are another key characteristic of civilization. And with cities, there has to be some planning that goes into it. Now, the most famous examples, the most well-known examples of massive architecture from the ancient world are your pyramids at Giza. Remember, those were for ancient tombs for the pharaohs, the oldest of the wonders of the world, and obviously still in existence today, and the ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia. Some ziggurats you'll see in a little bit more of a pyramid structure, but the thing to remember about about the ziggurats was that they were used for very different purposes from the Egyptian pyramids. As I said, the Egyptian pyramids were tombs, whereas the ziggurats were used for religious ceremony and purposes. The priests would go up onto the top of it, and they would look down on the people and perform their ceremonies and so forth. The commonality between the two is that both, they're big, they're imposing, they're meant to impress, and they're representative of the governments. The pharaohs wanted to build the biggest tombs for themselves. The kings and priests of Mesopotamia wanted to build the biggest temples. It was shock and awe technique against the commoners, against the people, to keep them in line. Now, urban planning, as I said, that's making sure that you have a planned out city. These pictures you see up here, okay, in the top left and then the bottom left, those are from Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro civilizations in the Indus River Valley, okay, what today would be Pakistan and India. And while they're very, very old and we do not have much in the way of really records from that time, not much in, hardly anything from, written records, there is evidence that this was planned out. When you've got the equivalent of it, maybe not roads, but alleyways and buildings that are on right angles like this. And you look at the planning map on the bottom there. It was very obvious that, or very evident, I should say, that thought went into this. And that's a big feature. They weren't just randomly putting up huts wherever they felt like it. They said, no, if we want to support larger populations in a city, we need to plan this out. And it wasn't all just about utility. Some of the things that were done at this time were built for show and grandeur, maybe a little bit different than the pyramids and the ziggurats, but still just to improve the look of everything. This we only have from written records of it, but down in the bottom here, you've got the famous Gardens of Babylon. All right, the gardens were not designed, but they were commissioned by this dude up here with the really long, oily looking beard, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a king of ancient Babylon, and according to legend, his wife was from more of kind of like a temperate, like tropical environment, and she was kind of missing home in Mesopotamia. So he built these gardens to appease her, and they stood for a long time, but they've since passed. But the reason I bring it up is to show that sometimes these rulers, they would do things just to make their cities look nice. It wasn't just about the impressive tomb that they could build, or the big temple. The same way that cities have parks, the same way that cities do, kind of public green spaces and so forth today. That's not something that's necessarily new. Now, the arts, another, kind of goes hand in hand with architecture. There's not a lot that you need to get down for this in terms of notes. Maybe if you just want to jot down a couple of things here, but, some examples. Here you have Egyptian pottery. The symbol here, the Ankh, A-N-K-H. That's a common religious symbol. It was a symbol of the god Osiris in ancient Egyptian religion. Not that there's anything particularly significant about the pottery, but it was, the ability to craft it. Over here, you've got Assyrian stone carvings. I remember what we said about the Assyrians. They were a warrior society, pretty badass warriors. So an awful lot of their artwork revolved around weapons and their war chariots and fighting. Over here, this guy with the wavy ramen noodle looking beard and the bug eyes, look like he is just perpetually surprised at everything. That is a Mesopotamian statue of a man at prayer. Again, nothing, revolutionary about it, but shows a couple things. One, it shows that realism was not much of a priority for Mesopotamians. We'll talk about, the contrast of that with ancient Greek sculptures. And then, as we move forward into the more modern era, nobody's got eyes that, it looks like Gollum. Nobody's got eyes that big. The importance of worship, the arms, the hands clasped and folded in the front is a ancient, kind of universal sign of prayer. And it showed the importance of religion, the importance of deference to the gods, like we talked about in Gilgamesh. Down here on the bottom left, you've got bronze, you've got urns, you've got vases, you've got sculptures in here of the Shang dynasty. Now, we haven't really talked much about the Shang dynasty. I'll do a separate video all about, the beginnings of Chinese civilization. But the Shang dynasty, they were very, very proficient in the use of bronze. And they used it for weapons, but they also used it for artistic endeavors as well. And over here, there's a quite large head, is an Olmec statue. Remember, we talked about the Olmecs. They were the earliest known Mesoamerican civilization in what today is Mexico. And it's still around to this day in archaeological and artistic exhibits. And it give a sense of scale of size with the gentleman standing next to it. So they were pretty big. Not a lot is known about the specific reasons for them. We know they were assuming some type of religious significance, but the Olmecs weren't always the best at keeping records, so we don't know too much about them. Moving on. Now, record keeping. We've talked a lot about writing, about the importance of writing. Writing allows things to be more universal. It allows things to be more objective. And that is especially true with record keeping. It moves civilizations past oral tradition. History could be passed down in, the kind of nomadic cultures, or even non-civilization societies, such as in Southeast Asia and throughout the Americas and Africa and so forth. But writing was definitely a big feature that set it apart. Cuneiform, right? We talked about that, was one of the earliest ones from ancient Mesopotamia. And cuneiform and hieroglyphics, those are picture-based. Okay, so again, cuneiform and hieroglyphics are picture-based. Somehow, if you were reading this through hieroglyphics and this bird and it looks like a rope and then another bird and a couple people, that made sense to them. How so? Haven't a clue. But, if you were an ancient Egyptian, you'd look at that and be like, oh, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Eventually, though, civilizations start to move past just picture-based because that's not very efficient. You don't get a lot of detail. You basically just get the gist of it. But for record keeping, that's not enough. You need more detailed methods of keeping records. And so that's where alphabets come in. And that's what we use, right? We have our 26 symbols, A through Z, that we arrange in different words. That's the whole concept of an alphabet. And not the first, but probably the first prominent group to use alphabets were the Phoenicians, right? I'll underline the name of them up here if you want to just get the spelling down of it. Hopefully you remember them from last year. The Phoenicians were big on merchants and sea trading. They established a trading empire throughout the Mediterranean. And because they were traders, then they were doing business with people all over the place, they needed a better way of keeping records and doing business as they were going all over the place. You couldn't keep records on stone tablets where, the only thing you had was I and triangle and bird and so forth. So they developed an alphabet. Now, very, very different from the alphabet we have today. It would eventually give some influence on later Greek alphabets, but a big deal in terms of spreading the use of alphabets through the Mediterranean and the civilized world. Another big use of writing was for legal codes. Right? It's no longer, this is what I say the law is as opposed to what you say the law is. No, it's written down. This is the way it is, and we all have to look at it the same way. And the most famous of the legal codes was the Code of Hammurabi. I remember him from last year. An eye for an eye, based on that idea of lex talionis, retribution. You do something bad to me, well, that something will be done back to you. Two big things to remember about the Code of Hammurabi. It did not protect equality of social classes, nor did it protect equality of genders. And it ensured superiority of the upper class, and it ensured patriarchy. Right? It protected men in circumstances where there are disputes between husbands and wives. And, as we talked about, hopefully you remember from last year, if a poor guy did something to a rich guy, the punishment was way worse than if a rich guy did something to a poor guy. There were some other important legal codes, but the Code of Hammurabi really was the standard bearer for it. Okay, religions, these new religions that developed. Egyptian religions, most of these religions were polytheistic. Okay, that's important to remember. The Egyptian religion, some of the gods, you don't have to remember too much of these here. You've got Osiris. He was the god of the underworld. And this here was, you see this guy with the jackal head. That was Anubis. And he would judge you. You see how he's kind of standing underneath the scale? He would weigh your heart. And, that would determine whether you would move on, or how you would move on to the underworld and so forth. So death was a big deal for the Egyptians. It was one of the reasons why they took such care for the dead bodies, particularly of their rulers, and they practiced mummification, to preserve and to protect the dead bodies into the afterlife. You have the Vedic faith as well. Vedic faith is kind of an ancestor of Hinduism. Hinduism being the largest religion in India. And for the Vedic faith, it established the caste system. Let me get those out of the way so you can read it better. Now, we remember hopefully a lot about the caste system from last year. One point to look it up here, you notice Aryans and non-Aryans. The Aryans were the group that came in and really displaced the original inhabitants of the Indus River Valley, and they brought with them their own sets of beliefs and social structures, and the caste system was a way to differentiate them from the non-Aryans, the original residents, such as like the Harappan and Mohenjo-Daro societies. So the white ones, your Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, they were for Aryans. The Sudras down at the bottom, they were non-Aryans. They were the farmers in the bottom of the barrel. Now, there's one group that's left out that we'll talk more about later, and those are your untouchables. But we'll get more into them when I go more into detail on Hinduism. There's a sacred text. There's sacred texts in all of these. You have, the Book of the Dead in Egyptian, and you have the Rig Veda. This language here that it's written in is called Sanskrit. Sanskrit is no longer used. It is a dead language, but it is also the sacred language, the sacred script of the Vedas, and so therefore the oldest sacred script of Hinduism as well. It's a collection of stories, so it's not exactly a single one like the Bible or the Torah necessarily. All right, got about a minute left here, so let me run through this fast. Monotheistic faiths start to develop at this point. Monotheism obviously meaning one God. The first one that really kind of developed with a group called the Hebrews was eventually developed into Judaism. It started to be called Judaism because when the kingdom of the Hebrews split with the Israelites in the north and Judah in the south, Judah was the one that remained independent longer. Now, what's unique about Judaism was that it started to put morality into it, right? The 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. Another religion that also talked about morality was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, another very early monotheistic faith. And you look down here, these good thoughts, good actions, good deeds, even though it's cut out. It talked about that there was reward for doing good and punishment for doing bad. Okay, I kind of had to cut things off very quickly there at the end from running out of time, but I can pick up with some more of these a little bit in the next video as well.